All right, let's switch gears. We're still talking about poise and composure for just a second, but we're going to switch gears and do one more thing which is going to help with our poise under pressure. And the term's called triggers, and how well you can actually identify your triggers. And let me explain that a little bit. Just like each of us have an ideal hype number, where you've got one individual who plays his very best consistently at a certain level of emotional arousal or hype, and another individual who may be at a very different hype number, understand that each of us have got key triggers. And these triggers are typically the things that actually snatch and rob, steal our poise and our composure. For some, it could be external expectations. Whenever they think about the media, whenever they think about some particular individual in the stands, it could be a big scout. For an individual trying to make the transition from college to pro, whenever they think about that, they play poorly. Or it could be an individual who's a scout as a player tries to make the transition from high school to college, and whenever they think about the pressure of that scholarship, they play poorly. For other individuals, it's different triggers. It could be a referee that just makes a terrible call. It could be a mistake made by one of your teammates, and you have a hard time dealing with those mistakes, both personally and publicly. It could be the thought of a family member, a mother, a father, or other caregiver in the stands watching you, and that individual, you typically play nervous when that individual is watching you. Could be a number of reasons. And on the board, we've got a whole list of different triggers. And this is not in any way a be-all and end-all list. This is not an exhaustive list. But it gives us a chance to actually think about these triggers. And the internal things can be just as damaging to you or I. And again, I challenge you, what are your triggers? If you could look at this list and pick the top 2 or 3, and again, this list is not exhaustive, so feel free to come up within your own mind 1 or 2 others that I haven't mentioned. And what are the internal triggers on the board? One is that cycle of anger and frustration, your inability to manage your own mistakes. You feel like you've just been embarrassed, you've embarrassed yourself, and all of a sudden, emotionally, you spin out of control. Some players can bounce back from mistakes, and we're going to be talking about this very, very quickly. Other players really struggle with that. Last but certainly not least, for whatever reason, there might be a trigger for you, which is a cycle of negative thoughts and doubts. Now, as soon as it starts, it's almost like the floodgates open up for you. More and more negative thoughts, more doubt, and it becomes a downward spiral. And again, I alluded to this earlier, but if you're that type of athlete, when you are good, typically you are really, really good. But when you're bad, you're typically really, really bad. And your ability to overcome this trigger is predicated or dependent on your ability to master your own mind. As is commonly said, a male or female athlete who can master their own mind will never be mastered by others. Small paraphrase on a very famous quote. So what do we do about these triggers? We look at these triggers almost like the analogy of Michelangelo sculpting David. May I explain that for a second? For those of you who have studied just a little bit of art, even if it's from a distance, you've heard of this magnificent statue called David, sculpted by Michelangelo, and he sculpts this huge, huge statue out of this huge block of marble. And as the legend goes, when he's done chipping away at this statue and sculpting this huge statue, one of his associates says, "Michelangelo, my goodness, how did you do this work of art, which surely is going to be admired for century after century after century? What did you do? Did you start at the feet? Did you start at the head? How did you do this?" And his response was what? He said, "When I saw that huge block of marble, for me, the masterpiece was already in place in my mind. The only thing I did is I just removed the inconsequential pieces of marble that didn't belong there." And it's the perfect metaphor for great poise. When you can identify and remove the 1 or 2 or 3 triggers that typically are responsible for you losing your composure, losing your poise, it is like putting a mental sheet of armor around your mind. But most mediocre players, most average players, they don't want to know that, do they? Because what do we typically do with our strengths? They say the ego is protected second only to life preservation. So to preserve our ego, we sure as heck will never admit these flaws and faults to someone else, our coach, and we sure as heck will never admit these flaws to ourselves. And yet we rob ourselves when we do that of the chance to be great. We don't protect our ego when we do that. We rob ourselves of the chance to be great. The smart athletes never, ever, ever stop working and never stop improving.